Gonna be hanging out in the hood.
Hi, welcome to Almost Cooperstown.
I'm Mark.
And this is Gordon, and we love talking about baseball.
So, this week, the Athletics started getting into news about whether or not they're going to actually stay in Oakland. And as we've talked about in this podcast before, they have moved before. But, you know, you've been around, the Athletics have been around long before you, but they've been in Oakland the whole time. What's your thought on the Oakland Athletics moving as we talk about ballparks and groundskeepers and all that?
Well, I guess for me, it's more interesting of thinking where they would be moving to rather than necessarily like why they're moving, because it's like I understand on some level there's a lot of teams in California, and I would understand why a team would think about moving there. But at the same time, I also think that part of the reason is like whenever I see that stadium, it doesn't look like a particularly fun place to watch or play a game there.
You're right about that, and it's one of the older parks, which we'll talk about later on in the major leagues, and kind of plays like it. In fact, I remember watching the Raiders play, obviously in the same stadium, and they were one of the handful of teams where you had the infield cutouts in the during the football game, and it would be just weird. And you thought, what about the baseball guys? I had a bunch of football guys running around out there.
Like that had to have some effect on the quality of the field that they're playing on, because the beating that it would take from that.
So, the Athletics, have only been there in a sense since, they came from Kansas City in 1967, I think. So it's pretty good long run when you think about it. They've been there for over 50 years. So it's not like they couldn't move, but you get so married to a team being in a city, it's really hard for me to think about them moving, particularly when they have that kind of history.
Right. And I think that I think moving them, not moving them, I don't know things that would help influence my decision. Like what's the attendance rates of A's games?
Not good. And everybody hates the park, like you were alluding to.
So what would fix it, and I think it's tough for ownership in that situation to necessarily weigh we could invest a bunch of money or get the state of California to invest a bunch of money, though they don't seem particularly incentivized to do that anymore.
Right. The whole thing was like the city wasn't going to pay for it, and then
we could find some other city that will pay for it.
Exactly.
But I also have to think, getting a new park would help, but would it help that much? Because it's not like the A's have been bad during this stretch. They've been a competitive team a lot of these years, and they still don't get the attendance. So I can understand why ownership would look to move a team like that, because building a new stadium might get you a temporary fan bump for a couple of years, but if you invest a ton of money in a new stadium and you're back at the current attendance numbers within a decade, it really wasn't an effective purchase for you.
And I think that's interesting with Oakland. So if you build a new ballpark, do you expect you're going to get 35,000? Because that's almost all you need now in some of these parks, right? You don't need to have capacities of 50,000 or 70,000 in order to make it.
I think you're better off going with a lower capacity park, because you're able to deliver a much higher overall quality of product to that number of people. I mean, we were at Citi Field recently, and even with despite it obviously being limited capacity,
20%, right?
It was still like you're able to deliver a much higher quality experience than I ever remember getting at like Shea Stadium.
I think that's true. And maybe I guess I've heard the A's, maybe Vegas, right? Vegas always comes up, and there's a bunch of other cities that are up for expansion. I, for one, hope the Oakland A's stay with the green and the gold, and they stay in Oakland, and that they kind of just maybe a new ballpark, and I hope it works out there.
I would always prefer a team to stay where they are and with their fan base, but at a certain point it's just like, how big does that fan base need to be to actually justify that?
I'm still trying to figure out the whole Kansas City thing, right? They moved from Philadelphia, where they were for over 50 years, and they're in Kansas City for 12 years. Nah, we're out of here. We're going to Oakland. So that must have been just weird for the people in Kansas City to have them kind of come and go like that before they got the Royals.
Exactly.
So I don't know that they have a particularly big home field advantage, do the A's, but we know that major leagues in general have about only a 54% home winning percentage, which is the lowest of all of the major sports, which I find, I guess, not that surprising, right?
Yeah, I guess it's not that surprising, though. You would think that, it's hard to believe that it has that much of. I wonder how much of an effect it is. I think, for one, it's lesser in baseball just due to the sheer number of games you're playing. You play so many more games that I feel like you're going to have more good teams picking up road wins because you just play a lot more games. So that's naturally going to drive down the win rates. But I also think in baseball, it's much tougher for the crowd and atmosphere to have a moment-to-moment impact on a game. Yeah, you could have the sense of anticipation, but it's not like the crowd chanting in basketball or crowd noise literally making it difficult to communicate in football. That's not as much of an issue in baseball.
That's true. And the really good pitchers in particular, right, don't get rattled by the crowd yelling in the big clutch situations where they can't do it. You'll see pitchers have that happen to them where all of a sudden they get into the moment and they get a little shaky.
I always think about if you remember, I think it was a play-in game right when they started the new wild card format between the Pirates and I want to say the Reds, because it was Cueto pitching. And the Pirate fans got to Cueto. You remember he was on the mound and he dropped the ball. He was standing there and he dropped the ball because they were getting to him so much. So it can definitely happen.
On an individual play, yeah.
I think it's much harder to have a sustained impact on a game that the crowds in other sports can't have.
Yeah. I think that's true. So, and we know as we're going to talk about, parks and groundskeepers, what are the better hitting parks right off the top of your head? If you didn't have to look, you probably would pick a few of the parks that were definitely being.
Yeah, I would say 3 off the top of my head that I would support immediately would be Coors, Arlington, and Yankee Stadium.
Right, but Arlington now is no longer, right? They have the new ballpark, so I don't even know
how that's changed.
How that's played.
I remember that was a barn box.
It was, and Coors Field is still in the top 10. But when I looked at the factors for 2021,
Citizens Bank.
Yeah, it's a great American ballpark in Cincinnati, and so I think over a 30-game season right now, which is what we have or so, it's too hard. It's just all you're seeing is what the trends are right now. And the weird thing is that for run scoring, Great American Kauffman Stadium in Kansas City, Miller Park, TD Ballpark in Florida, where the Blue Jays are playing. That's more indicative of the Blue Jays maybe than of the ballpark.
I think looking at a single season sample size, especially over the early 30
games, yeah,
it's not going to produce the data you want. You need to look year in, year out to account for the fact that, what if 1 year a team just isn't a particularly good offensive team in their stadium? Right. That doesn't mean it's not a hitter's park. It just means they're not very good.
Right. So, we talk about the home field advantage, and there is some evidence that umpires tend to make more favorable ball and strike calls on home hitters. And that is really interesting to me because there's enough evidence of it, obviously, that you would have some sort of a trend. So that's another reason.
The crowd affecting the umpire, you think?
Yeah, that's analysts have attributed to this to pressure applied by a vocal crowd. Unless umps are susceptible to fake crowd noise too, that shouldn't have been an issue last year.
That is true. It would be very interesting. That'd actually be a very interesting comparison to see if the bias towards the home team shifted at all last year because it was all artificial crowd noise.
Yeah, no, they did. They do have a graph that came up, in the StatCast area that shows that the more balls outside the strike zone were called strikes in the home parks than not. So that is if you're the away team. So there is evidence in there. So we're not surprised that umpires, whether they're conscious, they're certainly not conscious of it, might make calls in a particular way without even being aware of it.
Right. And I think it's just it is almost a chicken and the egg kind of situation. What came first, the umpire responding to the crowd pressure or thinking about it, or the crowd actually getting to him?
Right. So, and that doesn't matter which park, right?
No, that's universal across any park.
So, these umpires, and we've talked on this podcast about robot umpires and the idea that, at least from my point of view, and maybe you don't agree, that the umpires, there needs to be a way for some technology assist to be given to the umpire so that the umpire could consult it in some way without it being buzzed down from the major league office. Hey, you missed one. That's not going to work. There has to be some, and the umpires' understanding of their own fallibility and the desire to get it right that would have them consult something that would let them check what they think they saw.
I think it has something has to change, because I've seen way too many replays of at bats this year where there are multiple pitches that are well outside the zone that are getting called strikes.
Right.
I like that Wilmer Flores at bat,
right,
where like he gets called out on 3 consecutive strikes and not one pitch was in the strike zone for any 3 of the pitches. Like at a certain point, the problem is that I don't necessarily know if umpire has gotten worse or our ability to judge how an umpire is doing has gotten so much better.
Excellent point. Excellent.
Yeah. We're just like that we are just noticing things so much more.
And we have evidence now. We didn't used to have evidence. We didn't have a box. Say, look, the guy missed the call.
Yeah, no, you would just kind of, you would just maybe the most you would get is that a guy would have a reputation for having an inconsistent zone or something.
Right. And you should you really be? I don't want this to break down into an umpire thing or not, and we'll get off it. But the only point of mentioning it was, because the home they are calling more strikes, in favor of the home team. So there's bias there, and we're trying to eliminate bias. And so should we have umpires that he's got a high strike zone or he's a low ball umpire? I mean, should that really be the case?
Well, I think at the same time, having the human element of umpiring does make the game more interesting.
Yes, I agree.
So I think that attempting to remove all bias from it, the human element of refereeing and the judgment is important to the sport. So I think I'd rather give them the tools to make the calls more. I think consistency is almost more important than the accuracy.
Yeah.
I think that's where a lot of people, I'm fine with them missing calls. What I'm not fine with is a strike is a strike in 1 inning, and then 3 innings later, it's a ball. And you're just like, I don't know why that was called differently. Like, I remember there was a pitch in the Mets game recently where like the guy literally threw down the center of the plate and it was called a ball. And we're like, and I even remember the announcers being like, I guess that's a ball. Like, I don't understand how that happened, but okay.
Yeah. So, well, we'll see how they go at this. I just kind of think, I've said it before, tennis has managed to have it happen, and it hasn't made the game worse. It has made tennis a little more boring, actually. And so I worry about that a little bit in baseball.
It is interesting because like tennis, like you also have the element in tennis of like the field, the court itself. And tennis is obviously much more specific because, you're going to play differently on hard court than you do on grass, than you do on clay.
Yeah.
Composite. But baseball stadiums are different in that way too. And even the way they were being tended to impacted the game. I think obviously things are a lot more uniform now, but I mean, I've heard those stories of like what groundskeepers used to pull in the past to try and prep their field to be better for their team.
Yeah, and I assume that to whatever degree they're able, groundskeepers will do that. But in fact, in looking up for this podcast, I looked up something to say. So do you know why they wet down fields before the game? Why do they wet down the infield?
I would assume to try and slow the ball so that it's easier to field.
I think it was originally dust and so you're right on the consistency side, right? They're trying to come up with this most consistent hop as possible. But I remember the composition of the fields, and they're so much better at putting together what would make up the dirt infield, right? How much of it's clay and this, that, and other thing. But they were using, brought in dirt for the infields, but maybe it was just easier, not as easy, I should, to keep it all uniform, and it would just smoke during the game and the field would come up and be all dusty. So they water it down to keep the dust from sort of getting, and you've played on plenty of fields.
Oh God, they're
dusty fields.
Yeah, they're not fun to play on. But I also think that now, like one of the big paradigm shifts in regards to groundskeeping is I think the presentation of the field is so much more. Like I remember one of the things they always talk about at the beginning of the season is like what the grass they're using this year is. Like, like this is this particular, seed of grass that we're using. It's going to be this in the infield, with a cross section of this, the first part of the outfield into a different grass in the back part of the outfield. And they get so specific on that. And I have a feeling that it was probably never that hyper specific in the old days, but it was more just like, how do we make the field playable and work for us, but also, helps out our team in whatever way we can kind of massage the rules to work for us.
Well, and I think everybody knows the example of the Baltimore chop, right? Because though this was back in the late 1890s or whatnot, and they would let the infield dry out right near home plate so that the players playing, if you remember in the dead ball era, they're playing with these clubs that they just kind of chop at the ball instead of trying to drive it, and they can bounce the ball so hard off that hardened packed dirt in front of home plate, it goes up high that the guy can run to first base before the ball even is in the guy's glove on a ground ball.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and obviously, I feel like we don't want that kind of, like, in terms of the actual playing field itself. And I think that is something that makes baseball kind of different, is that, like, baseball fields aren't uniform, whereas virtually every other playing
the only sport.
It's the only sport where the playing field is not uniform from game to game. You look at, there's 10 baseball games going on in a day. You have 10 different fields.
Right. Hockey rinks have a little bit of, but even then they're more similar now than they used to be.
And there's still it's not like you have a hockey shape where there's also like this little section that just juts out extra.
Right. So, and being a groundskeeper, was more important, maybe it was more important before because they didn't have the tools and technology to take care of it, so that getting a game played without all those tools and all these crews, that we see today and specialists that can do all that to get a field ready to play, if you're thinking 50, 100 years ago, they had some real challenges.
Oh yeah, those old groundkeepers it was so much more just like knowledge and feel from years of experience. And so, I always remember when you watch those baseball movies, they always have that like crotchety old groundskeeper that like just somehow knows to like be able to talk to the earth and so they're able to like get the field pristine. And now it's a science.
Well, and so there's a few of these, old groundskeepers, and the probably the sod father, as he's called, Roger Bossard, was with the White Sox for over 50 years. So he joined the
certainly
White Sox
fitting the image of the grizzled old groundskeeper.
Right, well, actually, no. He started as an assistant to his dad. Okay, in 1967, he waits 26 years, and his dad retires, and he gets to be the groundskeeper, and he does it, for another 20 years after that. So his grandfather and his uncle, so it's like the family business.
Yeah, the family business is being the groundskeeper for the stadium. So in that case, you kind of end up getting the best of both worlds, because this guy has learned probably everything there is to know about the park itself. And now he's working with the science and the tools to make it look and perform even better.
So, and our Mets had a groundskeeper who also was there for almost 50 years. In fact, he was the head groundskeeper from the time they started. And even though he was a groundskeeper when they started, took over head groundskeeping in '74, Pete Flynn, and he held that post until 2001. And then instead of retiring, he went and joined the crew. So he was the guy rolling out the tarp out there. So I just think, talk about having a love for your job. And he was there for the Beatles in 1964 and all the way into before they moved.
So did he transfer over to Citi Field once it was built?
I don't know if he made it to Citi Field.
Oh wait, no, because he stayed with because I'm reading the little excerpt that
he has gone to Citi Field, right?
Yeah, because he went Polo, Shea, and Citi Field. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. So he died in 2017, but Pete Flynn, even Met fans know Pete Flynn, because of how long he was there, and other parks. So let's talk about some of the other parks and as you say, idiosyncrasies of those parks. So the only baseball only park that was built in the mid-'60s was in Kansas City, the Kaufman Stadium, or Royal Stadium, I think. Then they renamed it Kaufman for the owner stadium, and it was for 25 years. It was the only baseball-only park stadium, which is interesting. So the Chiefs would play in Arrowhead, obviously, and the Royals, but everywhere else you had so you had the Jets playing at Shea, and you had the Raiders in Oakland, and so on and so forth. And even the Angels shared it with the Rams, at one point. So a lot of the teams, had this thing going on. And how weird was it to be a groundskeeper, right? Where in the middle of your baseball season or near the end of it, when you're heading to the playoffs, you got to lay down sod if you can over the dirt infield park, which isn't going to take us. It's a dirt infield under. So a lot of people just left the dirt infield there, and it was weird.
Oh yeah, I always remember seeing those highlights of like old Raiders games where you see Marcus Allen running down the field and he's like running over the infield, part of the field, because that's just what was there.
So I also, and the Cardinals, who were a real speed team back in the 70s, had, Willie McGee and Vince Coleman, and they were definitely a running team. And so other teams, and I'm trying to remember, I don't know if it was the Royals in the 85 World Series or not, but they would overwater the base paths to try to get these guys literally stuck in the mud so they couldn't run. It's crazy. I mean, Coleman was a crazy base stealer. You could do anything you could to slow the guy down.
And I always it's not very sporting, but at the same time, baseball's always been probably the sport, the major sport with the most strained relationship to bending the rules and cheating.
Like not cutting the grass. Like maybe you have a team that, like any team bunts anymore, right? I guess I'm going to kill myself here, right? Because at one point when teams did bunt, right, you might actually leave the grass a little longer, that would make it harder for the other team to field your bunts if you were a bunting team. But
at the same time, even the dimensions of the field are going to play into how you construct your team. Like when you look at the Royals, they look at Kauffman Stadium, which is a pretty big ballpark. For them, they're like, we're not going to compete by trying to hit the ball out of here playing 82 games a season. So they built a team that was going to hit a bunch of doubles and run all over the place, and that won a World Series.
Right. And they played to their park. And the Astros, when they played in the Astrodome before where they are now, and is it still called Minute Maid Park where the Astros play? I can't even remember the name of it. It was Enron Field and Minute Maid Park, and then
changed it a bunch. I don't know, but
anyway, and we talked about that. Sponsorship names make it hard to remember what the heck you call the field. But the Astros, you really couldn't be a home run hitter in that air-cooled environment at 72 degrees. So they had AstroTurf, and they would build teams for speed and defense and pitching, and they had some pretty good teams, as we know as Met fans, that competed all the way into the 80s, and they were made to fit that particular ballpark.
And it is interesting because, it's something I don't necessarily think about because, it's so hard for me to kind of wrap my head around this, but a lot of the ballparks, you always think of ballparks as being these really old things, mostly because of the existence of Fenway and Wrigley, but there aren't actually a lot of older stadiums anymore. Like you're starting to get into the things where, like what was a new stadium to me is now one of the oldest ones.
Right. Well, so the old ones, right? We both can pick out the Fenway and Wrigley, right? I mean, I can't. There's nothing else, right?
Nothing even really approaches that level. Like those two are in a complete class.
But the third place one might surprise you, right? It might surprise people.
I think, because you wouldn't think about that. You wouldn't think like, oh wow, yeah, that's an old one, and is there because it's not a legacy team in some respects, with Dodger Stadium being the third oldest stadium now in Major League.
Well, not a legacy to Los Angeles, obviously.
Well, they're not one of the original teams.
Sure, Dodgers. They're Dodgers, but they're not in Brooklyn. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
They're not in Brooklyn. They're in. But the Dodgers have been there for coming up on 60 years, right? They opened in 1962 at Chavez Ravine. What people may not remember is they moved west in 1958, and they played in the Coliseum. So having gone to USC as I did, I remember when I went there a fairly long time ago, the seats were really far back from the field, even more than today, because they had the track in between from the 32 Olympics, that was there. So you were pretty far away from that. I can't for the life of me imagine how they configured a baseball stadium on that in that place.
How that would even work.
Right. So, but the Dodgers Stadium is the third oldest stadium in the major leagues. And that surprised me almost as much as the Angels Stadium, which we called the Big A when I lived in California. I don't think they call it that anymore. That is where the Angels play.
Which is wild to me because I would have never put them up there because it's just like, to me, they're almost an expansion team. I don't know why I think of them
60
that way.
years later, right?
But I think of them. I think it's only because pop culture has rotted my brain to the point where I associate the Anaheim Angels with the Anaheim Ducks from the Mighty Ducks.
Yeah.
So that's what I always think. So it's like, to me, the Angels, and because they changed their name so often, they were Los Angeles, and they've been like a billion.
Right, they started with Los Angeles, okay, and then they went to California, and then they went to Anaheim, and then back to Los Angeles.
Right, so when they probably became Anaheim at a time when I was a kid, so to me, they were like a newer franchise, even though they weren't.
Yeah. So both they and the aforementioned Oakland A's opened their stadiums in 1966. So,
it is interesting that three of the top five are all in California.
Right. In terms of their age, they haven't come in and built new stadiums. Kaufman Stadium opened in '73. We talked about that.
Which makes sense just because that was the team replacing the team that left St. Louis to go to Oakland.
Right.
Or Kansas City.
And Kansas City, they no longer have a turf field. In fact, there are only 2 AstroTurf fields in the major leagues left. Now, that's AstroTurf. I will say there is one other team that has a synthetic field, that's synthetic grass, that probably is going to become the wave of the future. But do you know the 2 teams that still play on artificial surface?
Well, one of them would have to be the Blue Jays.
That is correct. Oh, only when they play in Toronto, however, because right now they're playing in Florida and they're going to play in Buffalo, and I think both of those are grass fields.
Is the Minnesota Stadium?
Nope. No Target Field, the new field that they moved to out of the dome. We watched a game there today.
Oh, Tampa Bay.
Right. So Tampa, and I still don't understand. You lived in Florida for a while, so I guess everybody that lives in Florida says, of course you need a dome stadium because it rains every day in Florida in the summertime, and that's why Tampa put a team in the dome in Florida, which just seems crazy. But the Marlins have one too.
The problem is it should have been an open dome.
Yeah, right, a retractable one. When they built that place, obviously that was way before they did that.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, the Tampa Stadium is not one of the 10 oldest ballparks, which kind of blows my mind that it actually they built that thing with that in mind. After the Blue Jays at number 7, the 8th oldest park is.
The Rays are only a relatively recent expansion franchise because they came in with the D-backs in like '98, right?
They did, yes, that's true.
It's not surprising that they wouldn't be on that list.
That's true. That's true.
New.
The 8th team, oldest team, is the White Sox, and of course, White Sox fans will let you know that this is at first this was like the new Comiskey, right? The second Comiskey Park, and then they named it U.S. Cellular Field, and now it's Guaranteed Rate Field.
Yeah, and that's what makes it really hard to track some of these because you also could get into a really interesting philosophical argument. If you're dealing with Guaranteed Rate Field and you've replaced all of the amenities in it and you've replaced all the seats, is it still the same stadium as it was when it was second Comiskey Park?
If it were built on the same site and it was a refurbishment, I might say yes, but that wasn't the case. Not only that at Guaranteed Rate, or with the new Yankee Stadium, which I think is a good example, right? Because it's built on, but not on the actual same premise as this.
I guess for me it's more interesting. If you would take an original Yankee Stadium, right, and instead of moving it or changing it, you just completely renovated it and replaced everything within every single part of old Yankee Stadium with a new thing, but otherwise it was configured exactly the same.
Yeah.
Is that a different stadium than the original one? It's a philosophy question. It's the ship of Theseus argument.
Well, if home plate is where it should be, I kind of look at it that way, right? If you go to Citi Field now and you walk on the parking lot to the game, there's a place where Shea Stadium's home plate was in the middle of the parking lot.
Right, and that's the difference, is because Citi Field is a completely different field than Shea. It's not exactly where it was, but if you just slowly replaced all the parts over a number of years, it's an interesting thing to think about. What makes a stadium at that point? When baseball was kind of just before we got into the strike years in '94, Camden Yards opened in 1992, and I think like most baseball fans, it's a beautiful ballpark. It's a beautiful ballpark today. I've been to games there. I like to watch it on TV. The old buildings out there. It has a really retro kind of feel, and it still looks pretty good, I think. I think that's the thing that I think is that throws you off about Baltimore, is because everybody I knew Baltimore was a historical franchise. They've been around forever.
Right.
Tons of World Series. There's something about Camden Yards that just makes you think it's been there for a lot longer than since only '91.
Their prior stadium, Memorial Stadium, where both the Baltimore Colts, believe it or not, before they went to Indianapolis, and the Orioles played for years, was just a big kind of, I want to say, monolithic ballpark with very little interesting features about it. And even the old Shea Stadium, in that same vein, the power alleys were the same, down the line was the same. It was so symmetrical that it was a little boring.
Oh no! The old Shea Stadium was a boring stadium. No, don't get me wrong about that. It had very little personality to it.
Camden Yards was sort of like, oh, so this is the way a ballpark should be. And then 2 years later, the Indians, who were moribund, right? They were a bad team. That's kind of where the whole major league joke came out of, because, you know, they were really that bad for that long.
Yeah, they were actually the type of team that was so bad people thought they might be trying to lose.
Right. But in '94, they opened Jacobs Field. It's now known as Progressive Field, of course, in Cleveland. And what a great place to see a ball game. And I was fortunate enough to go to a World Series game at the Jake in 1995. And I watched Tommy Glavine just make the Indian hitters. And I've probably said this before in this podcast, look silly that night. But it was just a really great ballpark, and still is, I would hope.
But I think it's also that, I think it goes back to something we were talking about earlier with one of the things that all of these stadiums are doing by now reducing the number of people and the capacity. Like, it's interesting as you look as these stadiums open, like Jacobs Field, which is the 10th oldest stadium now, has a capacity of 35,000 people. Right. Whereas you go all the way back, even the stadium like Wrigley Field had a bigger capacity. Dodger Stadium's 56,000. So I think when you have those giant mega ballparks, it's actually hard to deliver the type of, like, you got to spend some money to go to a baseball game. So I think by reducing the number of people in the stadium, you're able to deliver a much higher quality experience for the fans that are there.
And certainly based on what happened through the pandemic, that, you know, baseball didn't have a good monetary year last year, nor did anybody given the pandemic, but they were able to survive because clearly they don't need fans in the stands in order to conduct a professional baseball season.
Exactly. It just makes the game more enjoyable.
So I think, you know, the summary here is that groundskeeping, we kind of like the romantic stories of how groundskeepers try to, you know, change the field and how you have to learn how to, you know, you still have to learn how to play the parks, but I don't think that the groundskeepers can have the impact on the game, and nor should they be able to have that impact to hopefully have an impact on the outcome of the game.
They shouldn't, because it's the same as if like your groundskeepers or your staff were doctoring the baseballs before the game.
Right. And so, but at the same time, as far as the idiosyncrasies of the parks themselves, right, if you are a left fielder and you play in Boston, I imagine you must take hundreds of balls off that wall in left field to make sure you understand exactly how the ball can bounce off that thing.
Every carom, every way it can go. It gets very interesting.
So there are all kinds of little things about some of these parks. I remember the little ramp up in the hill in was it in Houston, or they had the hill in center field? That was
in Houston. They got rid of it now.
Right, they got rid of that. That was a strange thing. The guy would have to think, and an infected place. The guy's like, I'm running up hills, I'm getting the fence. Why is there a hill here?
Yeah, why are we having to deal with this? I feel like that. Like, I think for me, if there's going to be any unusualities with the field itself, it needs to be with the dimensions and the way the walls of the outfield are constructed. There shouldn't be actually on-field obstacles for the players to deal with. That sounds like a really interesting game, but we're not playing that one.
Right. And nor do I think we talk about the Blue Jays and the Rays, and maybe the Rays to a certain degree do that, have a team that's sort of built, although they got a lot of home run hitters on that team now, right? More than they did before. But wouldn't they have a slashing and running team? That kind of was where they were at last year, I thought, until they became a home run hitting team.
Yeah, and I think every team in the major leagues is a home run hitting team right now.
Right. And how about trying to be the Blue Jays and have, you know, okay, so you build your roster, okay, to play on the turf field in Rogers, up in Toronto, but you don't play a game in there since, let's see, I guess it was September of 2019.
Yeah, that's interesting as well. But you also deal with the fact that, like, it's going to make more sense to build a team around hitting home runs, because even if you're not playing at your stadium, hitting a home run isn't going to necessarily change wherever you are. But if you go on the road and your team designed to hit the ball on the ground and run around a whole bunch, and now we're on some team with super long grass, it's a lot harder to deal with. And the ball out over the fence doesn't change from park to park.
I don't know how the groundskeepers get paid out of in the major leagues, actually, but I saw that, you know, and you would think that's probably the case. So if you're like a minor league groundskeeper, you know, you get like $13 an hour or $15. You're doing it for the love of the game. You're not getting rich being a groundskeeper. And maybe it's better at the major league level, but I'm not even sure if that's the case.
Yeah, I think that's very true.
So, we'll definitely have to be hoping that, you know, we get some news on the A's that maybe they'll stay around and they'll figure out a way to build a new stadium so we can maybe continue to watch baseball in Oakland.
Thanks for listening. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform.
And you can follow us on Twitter at Almost Coop.
the hood.